breaks down, I'm going to be talking about constructed wetlands and their elevation. And don't worry about that graph at the minute, but by the end of the talk, I hope you know what that means. I hope it means something to you. Oh, all right, there we go. So constructed wetlands are exactly what they sound like. We build them with heavy equipment. The equipment you see here is some of the smallest of the heavy equipment it takes to build a wetland. The really massive equipment is at the back end or the front end of this pipeline, several miles away, digging a hole somewhere, pumping all mud and water and coming out this end of it here, and then they got to drag the pipe around. And if it's sandy like this, they can actually get a bulldozer on it immediately. More often than not, you can't though, but you still have to have marsh buggies out there to drag the pipe around. And the point is to fill in an open water area like you see in the background there and turn it into a wetland. And I'm going to use different names. There are a lot of different names for this technique out there. I often say constructive wetlands. A lot of people call it a dredged material wetland because they're dredging out of the water somewhere to get the sediment. Some people refer to them, or some of them are, beneficial use of dredged material projects. And they say that because they got to do the dredging anyway to keep a navigation channel open. So what are you going to do with all this mud? You dredge out the navigation channel. You could pay to store it on land somewhere, or you could take it out in the ocean and dump it, or we can use it beneficially, like you see in the picture here, to build a wetland. Sometimes the dredging is not associated with navigation. It's strictly just so we can build a wetland, and then it's called a dedicated dredging project for restoration. Sometimes it's not for restoration though. Sometimes it's for profit. Sometimes it's to build a wetland for a mitigation bank, and that's actually what this one is here. This is dedicated dredging for a wetland creation project for a mitigation bank. Let's see. There we go. So here's a before picture from that same project. You were just now looking right at those bald cypress trees right there. That's the Mississippi River. It's pretty narrow down here. This is down south in New Orleans. It's about 1/3 of a mile. This water body here is about over half a mile wide. And this had been a wetland at one time in the early 1900s. It had been leveed and then farmed for a while, and then it probably went to pasture. There's some photos, I think, from the 1950s. It's still in pasture. Then the levee broke. And when the levee broke, it turned into a lake because during that time it was agriculture. The soil, which was a lot of organics, oxidized, and you just lost all that elevation. And then for many decades, this just stayed a shallow open water. And so you see this is August 2015, and then just a little over a year later, you can see that it's all been filled in. It's about 250 acres, if I remember right. What they did, they built 2 levees across the side here and here, and they filled it all in and built that wetland. And barely a year later, a little over a year later after that photograph, here's a ground shot at that same time. Those bald cypress trees you see in the background. There's a consultant there walking across this mitigation bank, and it's lovely. And this is barely a year after creation. And just look at all this wetland vegetation. It definitely appears to be a great success. And there's a lot of these constructed wetlands on our landscape, and not just here in Louisiana, but the example I'm going to show you to try to make you see how important they are is just with this program here, the Coastal Wetland Planning and Protection and Restoration Act Task Force. They've been around since 1993 building wetland restoration projects in Louisiana. They've got 27 marsh creation projects completed since '94. They spent, almost $480 million, built 12,000 acres of wetland at a cost of, about $40,000 an acre. And, wetland restoration in Louisiana is, we do a lot of it, we do it pretty well, and people in other states pay attention to what we do. And so this technique is certainly wasn't invented here, it's been going on before 1994, but we do a lot of it and people look to us for how to do it. And looking forward, there's going to be a lot of money for wetland restoration. And that's, unfortunately, the reason is because of the Deepwater Horizon BP oil spill in 2010, killed 11 people and put all that oil in the landscape. And there's a lot of money. There's billions of dollars going to be spent over the next, we still got like another 15 years to go of that money being spent. Louisiana has plans for it in wetland restoration. So in Louisiana is a master plan. In that master plan, they hope to build 40 of these constructed wetland projects at a cost of $17 billion, build well over 250,000 acres of wetlands, 321,000 acres. And, you know, with inflation, the cost is projected to go up to around a little over $50,000 an acre. So you can see, and that's just, you know, Louisiana's thing. So my point is that this is important, and even small gains in efficiency have big payoffs. You know, if we can just, you know, get 1%, I mean, that's another 3,000 acres. I mean, much more than that last project. And we get save 1% of $17 billion. That's a lot of money. So we want to be efficient with this, and especially since it's such a big thing on our landscape. It's a big part of restoration dollars. We want to be efficient with it. All right, so how do we determine if we're efficient or not? Well, usually what we do is like I showed you in that last picture. I showed you that picture of that beautiful wetland, and we all agreed, I hope you did, that it's got to be a wonderful success. And that's because we just naturally look to the vegetation to tell us whether or not it's a success. And formally, we do that in our restoration programs. We look and we actually measure how many acres of vegetation we have out there, how much vegetative cover we have out there. And there's a lot of good reasons why we should use vegetation as a measure of success. And the emergent vegetation, this is the stuff that, you know, is rooted in the soil but pokes out above the water in a wetland. And the good reasons include, well, this is the stuff that slows down the storm surge. You know, marsh grasses are okay at it. The wetland trees are even better. The vegetation reduces the wave height. Again, vegetation will reduce wave, grassy vegetation will reduce waves a lot. If the waves are down here, when it gets too high, you got to have the trees. This stuff, the vegetation creates fish and wildlife habitat, creates the food for a lot of the fish and a lot of the animals, creates the habitat they live and hide in, they nest in. It also creates the elevation that offsets subsidence. In coastal Louisiana, around the Gulf Coast, up in New England, into Canada, the coastal wetlands offset subsidence and sea level rise through the production of organic peat. It's crucial in creating elevation. Vegetation does that. The vegetation is what makes the soil strong. You know, I hate the phrase a fragile organic soil, because you go to the Florida beach, you stand there, pure beach. You got your foot on the water, you stand in knee-deep water, you move your foot back and forth just a little bit, you can dig a hole. The mineral matter doesn't give it strength. It's the live roots holding that stuff together that gives it the strength. Dead organic matter doesn't do you much good. It's about as good as sand. But live roots, man, that really gives you some strength. But the most important reason why I think we use vegetation as a way to measure restoration success is easy to measure. You can look at a picture and go, yeah, it's pretty good. We can go out and measure it maybe, but even with a picture, we can tell it's good. And we actually do a lot of this just with remote sensing nowadays. But it's not that shouldn't be our only measure of success. I believe we should also be using fish and wildlife as a measure of restoration success. And that's just not a part of any restoration program that I know of. Even though for 50 years in Louisiana, every presentation and document talking about our coastal wetland loss problem mentions fish and wildlife. The law that created the QIPRA program has 5 references to wetlands and the fish and wildlife dependent thereupon, or something similar to that. Almost all our restoration controversies involve fish and wildlife. It's oysters or alligators, oysters, oysters. And then the recent master plan that I showed you the budget for, they want to spend $17 billion on creative wetlands. They talk about fish twice as often as they mention vegetation. But yet, I'm pretty sure there's no plans to measure any fish or any wildlife on any of those projects yet. You know, but this talk is one reason why one thing I do to try to change that. And hopefully you will do what you can to change that as well. And this is just you see this picture down here. This is from the 2017 master plan. I just want to show you. It shows people out here using the marsh for the fish and wildlife. I think he's supposed to be fishing, this guy here, but it looks like he's playing golf. I'm not sure, but people are out here in the wetland, and it's about fish and wildlife for most of us, recreation. But there's a lot of challenges. A lot of the fish and wildlife we care most about move about. If they're birds, we call them migratory, and they fly around. If they're the fish, shrimp, and crabs, they come in and out of the coastal areas and back out to shallow coastal waters, but up in the marsh, we call that transitory. But the changes associated with their life cycle cause such great changes in animal abundance, it makes detecting a statistically significant difference in animal abundance really expensive. You have a large sample size to pick up a change. And even the resident fish and wildlife, like the alligators or the grass shrimp that live up in the marsh, even those are much more expensive to measure than the vegetation. And so that's one of the main reasons why we don't measure fish and wildlife. It's expensive to get a little data. I'm going to show you some data though. This is a map of coastal Louisiana, and it showing the coastal marshes, and the marshes are colored different colors to indicate what plant species are there. That's, they're really salty tolerant grasses out here in the yellow. You come into this brown and this light green, that's dominated by Spartina patens, and you see that it goes all the way across our coast. And that Spartina patens is actually our most abundant emergent plant on the coast. The data I'm going to show you are all from marshes where the vegetation is dominated by Spartina patens. The hope is that these data are you probably predicted that you'd see the similar pattern in other marshes that are dominated by Spartina patens. But it may play out differently in say the saltier marshes or the fresh marshes. But the data I'm going to show you are from this part of Louisiana here, Barataria Basin, and Lake Pontchartrain. So these are the 4 study sites we had, 2 on the North Shore of Lake Pontchartrain, 2 down here in Barataria Basin, all in where the natural marshes are dominated by Spartina patens. These are the names of the Quipper projects, if you want to look them up later. At each of these 4 places, we had 3 treatments. There's our open water, which we're gaining more of all the time in coastal Louisiana. We get more open water year in and year out as we lose coastal wetlands. So we're losing coastal wetlands and we're gaining open water. So that's the thing we kind of want to avoid. Well, the other treatment is the natural marsh, the stuff that's there already. That's what we want. We like it, we like the fish and wildlife in it. We like what it does to storm surge. And then there's our created marsh. Each 4 of these places has a created marsh in it. At each of the sites, at each of those treatments, we had 3 replicates in each of them. So we had 36 sites altogether. We, being Scott Harleman, who collected all these data and processed all the samples and organized the data and made it a real, just did a great job with the study. He went out there all 4 seasons, all sites. I helped him a few times and ended up with 144 samples. And what he's collecting out there are fish data. Let me show you. All right. But first, before I show you the fish data, let me give you a little overview of what these projects look like. So they were constructed 2009 to 2006. They range from less than 100 acres to almost 500 acres in size. Here's a target elevation at construction. And all pretty high up there. This is 70 centimeters above roughly 0, which is, you can roughly think of as mean water level, although that's not what it is. We don't need to get into elevation datum right here. But notice after 3 years, they have a lower target elevation. This would be a whole lot easier to do if you didn't have this loss of elevation over time. But what's happening is when you pump these sediments, they come out a little bit fluffy and they deflate. And so that's going to happen. And then the sediments that you pump up there, even though they were I use the term fluffy, they are massively heavy. We're talking tons. And so they induce subsidence beneath them in the pre-existing sediments that would not have occurred otherwise. And then you've got natural subsidence that's just kind of common across the whole landscape ongoing as well. And so for those reasons, it takes about 3 years before you get rid of those, the deflation of what you pumped, and then the induced subsidence of what you smushed, and then before it kind of settles down. And so then this is their target after the time. Notice that at 2 of these places, they're quite above their target. And they're 40 centimeters. That's getting up there. The other one here, they got changes over time, and they got closer to their target elevation, but they still didn't hit it even 2006, 5 years later. Still did not get down to target elevation. And it's my impression, the reason I got this study going is, and other people talking to, is that many of our constructive wetlands are too high. I've been across the coast helping the restoration program, looking at sites that were going to be restored or people wanted to be restored. And we would be there and we'd look at that site and go, well, let's go look at that site. We built a project over here several years ago. And we can't get the airboat up in there. It's too high. And I heard that once or twice a year for about 3 or 4 years in a row. And I started thinking we're building them too high. And that's my impression, and other people's too. All right, so 2 things we're going to measure in these created marshes and the natural marshes and the open water. Habitat quantity. How much fish habitat out there? How much fish habitat is out there? And so what we came up with is a really dumb way of doing it, but it's kind of robust, and I think it's actually superior to doing LIDAR, which is a really fancy, high-powered way to measure an elevation. What we did is we went and picked a random spot out in the marsh. That's what that little X means there. Ahead of time on the computer, random point, went to it by GPS, and then we went and found the closest place from that point to throw the fish trap. Fish trap is 1 meter square. It's actually a square, but for the purpose of thinking about it, let's imagine it's a 1 meter square circle. Well, if I know that area and the distance from my random point to the fish trap, then I can calculate also the area that didn't have any fish data in it. And that's how I got my estimate of habitat quantity for fish in these created marshes. As dumb and simplistic as it is, I have yet to meet anyone who has not a single estimate of fish habitat in these marshes, let alone a better one. People just haven't been doing it. There's no money to fund this type of monitoring. For habitat quality, when we got to the fish habitat, Scott would go throw this fish trap. This is a 1 meter square box. It's got no bottom and no top. It's got a net attached to the top with some floats on it so you can go in water over 1 meter deep. And then after he threw it in there, then he'd crawl out there and scoop all the fish and crabs out and all the submerged aquatic vegetation and bring it back to the lab and spend weeks sorting them into different species and then identifying them as well. And so this is one of the natural marshes where we worked. This is one of the created marshes where we worked. Here's the pole. And I took this while we were walking around looking for fish habitat. This is another of the 4 sites we worked at. Here's a pre-existing marsh. You can see pretty easy. You're going to come into fish habitat fairly quickly in this marsh, no matter where you are out there. Here's a created marsh. This one had fish habitat throughout it, but I want you to notice this is not Spartina patens growing here. This is cattail, which can't take salt water. Yet this giant 5-year-old marsh is surrounded by water too salty for it. Surrounded by marshes dominated by this marsh here, dominated by Spartina patens. This is another suggestion that this marsh is too high. It's a perched freshwater wetland in the middle of a tidal system. All right, let's get to the data. So in the natural marsh, here's the mean distance to finding fish habitat. Here's the median distance, maximum distance, and here's how many meter square of fish habitat there'd be in 10,000 meters square in a hectare, 88. In the created marsh, there would be less than 1 meter of fish habitat in the created marsh per hectare. In open water, well, there'd be 10,000 acres of fish habitat per 10,000 acres of open water because it's all fish habitat. But you know, we got enough of that stuff. So it's pretty clear we don't have enough fish habitat, and the reason is I think the only logical reason there's not fish habitat there is that it's too high. I have no elevation data to show you. I will want to show you a little bit of data though about the quality of the habitat in here. And the message is going to be here, it's pretty much the same stuff. There's hardly any of it, but if the fish can get to it, it's pretty much the same habitat you see in the natural marsh. So here's a list of usual suspects. If you're a fish person, these are your resident crustaceans. This is crawfish, this is your grass shrimp. Here's your transient crustaceans, that's blue crab, a couple of shrimp. Here's your fish in terms of biomass. These are your resident fish. These are the guys that live there pretty much their whole life up in the marsh. These are transients, anchovy, mullet, speckled trout, eel, just the usual suspects. I'm not saying that the communities were exactly the same. There are some differences there. They're worth talking about at another time, but for our purpose, the fish communities are very similar, but they are not identical. You're not getting the same fish habitat in a created marsh and natural marsh, but you're getting a lot of the usual suspects. We see some changes over time. As you expect, the resident fish are the most abundant out there, followed by your resident crustaceans. And the reason that the transients go there to eat the residents. So there's fewer transients, but they're going up in there to eat the residents. Say the patterns are like you would expect. I am going to walk you through the table to show you a couple of statistical differences that showed up. In your resident fish, there was no difference between the biomass of naturally created marshes, but they had more of it per square meter than open water. And that's like we'd expect. When you go out in the marsh, there are not a lot of fish out in the water. They don't want to be too far away from grass. That's why the fish we want to catch, fishermen hang out near the grass because the big fish are eating the little fish near the grass. And that just is reflected here. There's more fish per square meter up in the marsh than there is out in open water. Same thing is true of the biomass and the numbers of fish. So biomass and numbers play out the same way. There's no difference statistically in total biomass of natural and created, but more than you'd see in open water. There's a difference over here in the numbers of transient crustaceans. And the blue crab is our most important one. They're just not getting up in our created marshes. There's hardly any in our created marshes. There's a lot in our natural marsh, but the blue crabs don't get up in the marsh as much, not the ones we were catching anyway. The open water actually had the most blue crabs. So anyway, that's it for the fish community. All right, so the conclusion of that is that the constructed marshes provided 1/88 of the habitat provided by our natural marshes. And they're costing us a couple of dollars per acre. And we're building them too high. Why are we building them too high? That's the second part of the story. Oh, we're 2/3 done actually. All right, so people have been constructing wetlands for a long time. This manual is from 1983. It's a Corps of Engineers manual written, to sum up what had been learned in the past 10 or 15 years about this stuff. And even then, we know if we build it high, we're going to get upland stuff. If we build it lower, we'll get this high stuff. And we want to get down here in the water, we better build it down here in the water. And that's kind of the way things were going, I believe, back in the 1980s. Just a few years later, this is from 1987. This is from the National Research Council, and it's a small book on responding to changes in sea level, engineering implications. And they looked at some projections of what sea level would do over the next century and ignored them and came up with these three estimates here of 50 centimeters, 1 meter, and 1.5 meters. Totally just arbitrary, but that's what they suggested people worry about. And as far as I know, this was totally ignored in the wetland construction realm, as it probably should have been. But you come up to 2009, and things had been changing. This was not the first we heard about this. This was the end product of some talk that had been going on quite a while. This is also from the Corps of Engineers, and they came out with some water resource policy and authorities incorporating sea level change considerations in civil works projects, and said that you must You must, if you're getting federal dollars, build for sea level rise. You have to account that in your plans. And they went ahead and threw out the three projections that the NRC had given in the late 80s, which were kind of, really out there. And instead went with what the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have been saying, and this was the range that they had, said, okay, you got a plan for this. If you're building something and you're telling the public it's going to last 100 years, you need to make sure it's going to be on this blue line in 100 years. And if you're telling the public it's going to last 20 years, you better be back here on this blue line. So that was the guys that came out, and I didn't think it should apply to coastal wetlands, but it did, at least in Louisiana. I'm not sure if that happened nationwide, but at least in Louisiana, this is what we started seeing. Okay, so 20 years from now, we need the elevation of the marsh to be here. We've got sea level rise and subsidence going on, so we got to take that into account. And then we got to take into account our induced subsidence and our deflation. And so we're building way up here to get a wetland out here. The problem is that, well, the wetland is out of the water for the first 5 or 10 or 15 years that we build it then. And there's no reason for that, because this ignores the fact that natural wetlands vertically accrete. Marsh vertical accretion is a natural process that occurs in coastal wetlands around the planet, where they build up either through sand, silt, and clay brought in by the tides or by peat produced by the vegetation. Turns out, like I mentioned before, on the northern Gulf Coast, it's peat. Southeast Atlantic coast of the United States, it's mineral sediments. New England, it's peat. In many places, in some places, it's a mixture of the both, back and forth, in between. You require both of them. But this is what people should have been planning for, in my mind. The idea that, yeah, you got to build it up here because you're going to have some deflation and some induced subsidence, and then the natural subsidence. But after a while, the marsh is going to start accreting on its own. That's what marshes do. You don't need to build way up here now. You don't need to put this line, back that line all the way up. And so for a while, though, that's not what was happening. And that's why I think we're seeing all those constructive wetlands built would appear to be too high. Turns out, when I used to show this was theoretical. It's no longer theoretical. The black dotted line here is real data from one of the wetland creation projects that we sampled without any planning. And these are and it's doing just like you would predict based on what we knew in the 1990s. You don't need to build a coastal wetland so high now so that it will be intertidal in 20 years or 30 years or 50 years, whatever the life of your project is supposed to be. Here's the map. This is a project, and that's the location of it. Just some of the facts from that project there. A lot of mud was moved. So this is not. We shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't have been doing that. This is what's really happening, and we're actually getting there already. Before I show you the already, I want to show you another way of looking at marsh creation. This little cartoon here shows time 1, and over time you're going to have your natural subsidence, and you're going to have sea level rise. And this is a natural marsh without any creation on it. But we could make this a marsh creation project. But in this natural marsh, what you see is the accretion. And this is, in some parts of the world, this is going to be mineral sediments. In coastal Louisiana, this is peat, root material. But this is what's going on with marsh creation. We just need to build this, and over time, we'll get this. This is free unless we fill it up with mud ahead of time, and then it's not free. We can pay for that too. We don't need to pay for the free part. And that's the way that we need to keep looking at this. And we are. I just got this about 6 weeks ago. This is on the South Shore of Lake Pontchartrain. This is a QIPRA project that was approved in 2009 for funding that's slowly working its way through the system. As it's worked the way through the system, they've been listening to this debate. They've seen some of these data, and look at all the fish ponds they're putting in here. And what's really cool about this to me is how they're doing this. they're going out ahead of time before they pump and digging holes. I want to say they're digging them 7 feet deep. Then they're going to come out here, and this is where all the sediment, when they open up Bonnie Carey Spillway from the river, it comes out up here. They're going to take that sediment, because here's the Bonnie Carey Spillway. They're going to mine that sediment and pump it over here. And they're going to fill it up completely even across the top. But then the extra weight of that sediment in the sediment holes is going to cause much more induced subsidence under those holes than adjacent to them. And they should end up with ponds throughout their marsh. And they're hopefully going to have a tidal creek as well, connecting some of them. I'd like for them to connect to all of them, but you know, that stuff does increase the cost of the project. And since getting that, I've also seen projects that are in various stages, early, not as old in the system, more recent in planning, where they're reducing the amount of sediment they think they need to pump, which is reducing cost. Well, they're reducing the amount of elevation and the sediment they need to pump, and instead of building it high, they're spreading it out and getting more acres. And so this was a problem 2 years ago. I was still really PO'd about this problem, even last fall. But we've turned the corner and things are changing because, you know, there are a lot of good people out there and they're paying attention to it. So here are my last 2 slides, got a conclusion slide. We have to build them too high, and there's some good reasons. You know, the sediments are going to consolidate on their own weight. They're going to deflate. We're going to induce some consolidation. I didn't talk about the fact that these sediments have no plants in them. And baby wetland plants cannot do what a grown-up wetland plant does, which is pump a lot of oxygen underground. So these baby plants need extra elevation as well. But putting elevation up to reduce storm surge is kind of dumb. If you want to reduce storm surge, build a levee. I can't prove it, but I think it'll be cheaper to build a levee than a created marsh, you know, many miles from the house you're trying to protect. Also, we don't need the extra elevation to survive sea level rise and subsidence. Marsh runoff accretion will do it for us for many, many decades, even in the most rapidly subsiding parts of Louisiana. In much of Louisiana, it'll do it for centuries. And so the big thing is we were building them about right before. We got too high for a while, but we're back on track. And so it's a good story, I think. And that is everything I have to say. I'm going to stop sharing, and hopefully someone's still awake out there.